I am pleased to recognize the ranking member for his open statement. Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thanks for holding this hearing today. As this is my first hearing as Republican leader on the Oversight Committee, I want to start by saying that I very much look forward to working together with you, as well as other members of the subcommittee, specifically on issues of bipartisan concern. Personally, I must say that when I found out we'd be serving together on this committee, I was particularly delighted. I so fondly remember our time in Alabama as we walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge with my grandson back in March of 2015 to mark the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March. At that time, George was 8 years old, and you were so gracious with him. We have many pictures of the two of us talking with George. And one of the things that George and I talked about, I said, Georgie, you and I are going to come back for the 100th anniversary of the bridge, and we're going to walk across together. He said, well, Grandpa, how old are you now? I said, I'm 65. He said, Grandpa, you're going to really be old. And I said, well, maybe you can push me across the bridge. But you took time to spend with that little 8-year-old, and he still has those pictures and those memories to go with it. So serving with you on this committee is phenomenal. And I know that you and Chairman Jenkins had good working relationship, particularly with things like the bill to redesign the IRS. And I'd like to continue to build upon that foundation in this Congress. Also, the primary role of this subcommittee, I believe government oversight is an important role for every member of Congress because we are the taxpayers' watchdogs here in Washington, as well as being legislators. Government oversight is critical to the protection of taxpayers and the safety of all Americans. As Senator Grassley once said, oversight is about keeping faith with the taxpayers and giving people confidence that the government plays by the rules or is held accountable. And that is the role I hope to play on this committee, and I look forward to serving with you in this capacity, Mr. Chairman. Now, for today's hearing, I want to start by stating the obvious. All Americans, every single American has a right to privacy in personal information contained in their tax return. That's why we have a statute in law, 6103, that covers every American from the president to your next door neighbor and your family. It mandates that the federal government must keep tax returns and tax return information private. Congress enacted taxpayer protections embedded in Section 6103 of the tax code to ensure that every American's privacy and to prevent the use of taxpayer information being made public. Americans should be able to trust that the federal government or some unelected bureaucrat in Washington is not going to publicly release their tax returns without the taxpayer's consent. Tax returns can have a lot of sensitive information in them. It's not just all income and expenses and deduction. There's information on where you live, what you do for a living, what kind of car you drive, information on your bank account, which cell phone is yours, whether you have health insurance, and the names and social security numbers of your spouse and all of your children. Keeping this information confidential is critical to the integrity of the U.S. tax system, which is only functional because taxpayers voluntarily pay their taxes. According to the National Taxpayer Advocate, 98% of all tax revenue paid by American taxpayers is paid voluntarily. That means that only a small 2% percentage of taxes are collected through audits and enforcement. 98% is voluntarily paid. 98% of anything is a lot, so I have to take a closer look and ask why. I believe this is because of the trust the American taxpayers have in our system, and in the privacy is at the foundation of that trust. Now, some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have suggested using this committee as an avenue to obtain and release the president's tax returns in the name of transparency. As leaders of the Ways and Means Committee, I don't believe we have to choose between protecting privacy and promoting transparency among public officials. To begin with, Congress is prohibited by law from examining and making public the private tax returns of Americans for political purposes. Such an abuse of power would open a Pandora's box it would be tough to get a lid back on. It would set a very dangerous precedent. And the question is, where does it end? What about the tax returns of the Speaker, members of Congress, or federal employees, or for that matter, any political donors? There is no end in sight for those whose tax information may be in jeopardy. Thankfully, violating taxpayer privacy is not the only option for increasing transparency. I support the current ethics review in place, which ensure that presidents and vice presidents are held accountable to taxpayers. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle have voiced the need to have experts review the president's tax return with a fine-tooth comb. But isn't that the exact reason why the IRS, the agency with just that level of expertise, conducts mandatory audits of the president and vice president every year? Yes, that's right. The IRS audits the president and the vice president every single year, whether he or she is a Republican or a Democrat. I don't think most Americans know that's the case. I certainly didn't know it until I started doing some research myself and inquiring. In addition to IRS audits, there are also financial disclosures required. If my colleagues have a valid concern with the financial disclosure requirements, then let's come together to legislate a thoughtful solution to require additional disclosures. If there are challenges in obtaining required documents for disclosure, then let's look how we can make that process better and more transparent. But the reckless sharing of a taxpayer's private information for political purposes would be unprecedented and completely outside the bounds of Congress's role as a legislative body. Our role is oversight and certainly not overreach, and we can and must do better. Therefore, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how to do that better. That is, how to best protect our American taxpayers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's great to be with you.